Hey YouTube, do-it-yourself junkie 369 here with another chess tutorial / lesson, and this is video number 3. If you haven't seen the first two and you have no idea how to set up the board, go back and watch those. Or if you need to know how the pieces move, or if you need to learn algebraic chess notation, because when I do the moves on screen at the bottom, I'm going to have the move in algebraic notation so you can follow along with what's going on. This video is going to be about chess openings. One of the most daunting tasks for a beginning chess player is what pieces do I move first. And I'm going to cover 4 openings by white and 5 responses by black to those openings. And at this point, you're not going to understand the tactics or theory behind the opening, so we're not going to go in depth into that. We're just going to go over the moves, and you can rewatch the video. I'll put a time link for each opening, and you just need to go over them and kind of memorize them to begin with. Later on, when you start developing sound tactics and a deeper understanding of the game, hopefully by then I'll have a video up going in depth onto what these openings do and how you progress from the opening into the mid game. So when I was learning how to play chess, I was taught that you wanted to control the center of the board. That's the most important part. And so openings would be either e4 or d4, followed by maybe moving a knight to f3 or a knight to c3. And this is either attacking a square in front of the pawn or defending a pawn, depending on which knight you move up. And then bishops are free to move up to c4 or bishop to f4. And these are kind of out there, unsupported, unprotected right now, but you could push a pawn to protect them, or maybe not put the bishop that far up the line and keep it behind the pawns. So either this position or this position is a really strong opening position, kind of what you're looking for as you start playing. And obviously the queen could come up here in front of the king, queen to e2, or you could take the queen up to d3. And that frees up your king to castle to either side. And that's not ever really going to happen in a game in this layout, because black's responding every time you move a piece. But this is kind of an ideal position. It's got strong center of the board control, and you're attacking, especially with this white bishop, this weak pawn here on f7. So one of the few moves that you absolutely do not want to do as white is pawn to either f3 or f4. And usually if I see somebody open with this, my first move is going to be take control of the center of the board with pawn to e5. Now, moving this pawn up, you've opened up this diagonal for the king for attack, and you've weakened the king side pawn structure, and it's going to make it really difficult to defend the king by opening up this side. The worst thing you can do after pushing this pawn is pawn to g4. And this opens up a situation which has become known as fool's mate, which is checkmate in 2 moves. Black takes their queen to h4, checkmate. There's 3 things to look for when you're placed in the check. The first is, can you eliminate the piece that is putting you in check? There is nothing attacking this queen. You already pushed this pawn up, and there's nothing it can do. The second is, can you block the check? As I said before, this pawn was here. Now that's pushed here, you cannot pull it up and block the queen's check. And then the third option is, can you run away? The king only has one option for movement, and it's up here on this diagonal, which still leaves it in check, and therefore that is checkmate in 2 moves. That's what you absolutely do not want to do. And I've seen the reverse happen to black, but because white moves first, you would have to have black move a couple of times, which would really end up being checkmate in about 3 moves, which is just as embarrassing. Now, another thing you need to watch out for is checkmate in about 4 moves. And usually beginning players like this because they're playing against other beginning players who might not recognize this. So you do a strong opening with pawn to e4. Black follows suit, pushing a pawn to e5. White develops his bishop to c4. Now, sometimes black will copy, which is kind of a crazy move to do, or they might do something else like develop a knight to defend this pawn. Either way, white's move is almost always the same for the next move, which is, so we went ahead and used black bishop to c5. White moves the queen to f3. If black realizes what's going on, there's a couple defenses here that black would want to do. You can either move your queen up to this square, bringing the queen out a little bit early, kind of risking losing it, and that would be queen to e7. Or you can simply push a pawn to f6, or you can push the knight to h6, and basically the queen or the knight move, you're looking at protecting this square from the queen. And with the knight move, it's a bad move because you have the knight on the side of the board, and as I've stated in the previous video, that effectively reduces the knight's attack in half. It removes half the squares that the knight can move to. But in this case, it protects the square, which is pretty important, but it also opens up the king to castle to the king's side. Let's say for whatever reason white doesn't realize that's what's going on, and they play this knight to c6. The 4th move for white is queen takes f7, and that's checkmate. So there's no piece that can take the queen. The king is the only piece in position to take the queen, and if he does that, he's being attacked by the bishop, and you cannot put the king in check by a move. There's no piece that can block the check because the king and queen are so close together. And the king only has 2 open squares to move to, here or here, and neither one of those remove the king from check, so that makes this checkmate in 4 moves. So those are the 2 types of openings that you want to be aware of. One's bad for white, one's bad for black. And this can be reversed around, and black can use this on white if white's unaware of what's going on. Other bad opening moves are pushing any pawn in front of the rook. Some people will play this pawn to a4. Black takes control of the center. And the plan for white was to get this rook out early in an open file, but as soon as he moves here, he's under attack by this black bishop, which immediately causes him to be down 5 points when he loses the rook, and white at most is going to gain a bishop. So moving any pawn in front of the rook is bad. It does nothing to control the center of the board, and it just weakens your flank for attack. Another bad move, not necessarily a horrible move, but kind of a pointless move, is to push the pawns in front of the knights. G4 is a very good example of that. As soon as you push this, I come up here and attack. And white's probably thinking, well, if I take this pawn here on h5, I'm just going to lose my pawn when he takes it with his rook. So if he took here, rook would move and take h5. So white probably doesn't like that, because now he's down a piece and this rook is out in the open just to run rampant all over the board. But he doesn't want to lose this unsupported pawn. So he pushes f3, and I've already shown you why this is a bad move. Because now black is going to play something, ignoring that pawn and pushing a pawn to e5, opening up the queen to come down here for checkmate. And there really isn't response for this. About the only thing black can do is push this pawn up here to d3 to give the king a chance to escape. So queen would come down to h4, putting the king in check, and the king has to move to d2. There's nothing else that could come over here and protect the queen and stop that from happening. The only other option from this position would be to push this pawn, which would only delay the inevitable queen coming down for the check, or the checkmate if you don't open up anything else. So pushing any pawn in front of the rook and the knight is bad. There are some openings that push pawns in front of the bishops, but usually that is more of a second move. The last thing that you don't want to do on an opening is knights can jump over pieces, but you don't want to go knight to a3 or knight to h3. And as I've said before, just earlier in this video, putting the knight here, you've reduced the amount of squares he's attacking. That knight now is attacking 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. Versus if he was here, he's either attacking or defending 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. So as I said, most daunting part of a chess game is the beginning, especially for people who are just starting out playing. You don't quite know what to do or how to start the game that's not going to end in total ruin. And I've shown you a couple ways to avoid that. Now we're going to go over some ways that are good openings, and we're going to cover 4 for white first, and then we're going to cover 5 defenses for black. And most of those are in response to the 4 moves that I show you for white. And these are good openings, and they're the most played probably in all of chess. So the first couple openings we're going to cover for white deal with opening with the e4 pawn. And this is played probably somewhere around 75 to 80% of the time in chess games. Probably even higher than that, because they're looking at these statistics on recorded games that are actually submitted somewhere. But I would say almost every game I've played, just about, white has opened with the e4 pawn. From there you can go into the king's gambit. So black's response would be e5, not wanting to give up control of the center of the board, at which point white pushes the pawn to f4. Remember I said there's some openings where the pawn in front of the bishop is pushed, and this is one of them. And this is called the King's Gambit. And the Gambit is this unprotected pawn has a tempting target for black to take with f4. And this is the Gambit accepted, which is the best thing for white to hope for, because at this point white has basically two really good options. You can do what Bobby Fischer did, and he plays bishop to c4, not worrying about this pawn at all right now. Or you can play knight to f3, which further develops your control of the center of the board. And basically, at this point, black has done two bad things. One, they've doubled up pawns here, and they've done it to the outside of the board rather than inside of the board. And black might respond by protecting this pawn by pushing a pawn to g5. At which point I would go ahead and play bishop to c4, and now you've opened up the king for this castle. Really, ideally, black would decline the gambit, and what black wants to do is either push pawn to d6, which protects this pawn, although white's not going to take it, probably, because that's not the ideal behind the gambit. The gambit is to draw your opponent off center here and ruin his center control of the board. So not declining the gambit and pushing this pawn gives you a good strong pawn structure, but it blocks off this black bishop. The other good response from black would be bishop to c5. And what it does is it now puts pressure on this knight and this weak pawn position here that's opened up from playing the gambit, and it ruins, at least for now, any chances that white plans on having of castling to that side of the board. So those are good two responses for black on the King's Gambit. Another e4 opening that is usually played by white, and this is probably one of the most popular openings. Obviously white plays pawn to e4, black responds with pawn to e5, but instead of playing the gambit, white plays knight to f3, attacking this pawn. At this point, black has to respond by protecting this pawn, otherwise he gives up control of the center of the board. So black plays knight to c6, and I see this opening almost every game I play. Almost. I'm saying like maybe, I want to say upwards to 90% of the time this is the opening I see happen. So at this point, at this point white is going to play bishop to b5, putting pressure on this knight, especially if black decides to push this pawn. Now this knight is pinned to the king. The other option is kind of a little bit more subdued, but white plays bishop to c4, putting pressure on this weak pawn here. And if you remember, this is kind of the setup or the start for that 4-move checkmate. So that covers the two most popular openings using white pushing a pawn to e4. There's also the Queen's Gambit, which is not really a gambit, but it kind of mirrors the King's Gambit. It's just on the Queen's side. So white would open with d4. At which point black mirrors. That way they don't have an immediate pawn battle here in the middle. So they push the pawn to d5 to stop the forward movement of that pawn and to control some of the center of the board. Which point, in gambit fashion, white pushes a pawn to c4, hoping that black will take this pawn. It's not as strong as the King's Gambit. About all you can do is once black takes that pawn, you would push up, take the pawn back, and you have pulled black off center a little bit, and he has moved a pawn twice versus you develop some pieces, but you lose a little bit of momentum when you take that pawn back. On the plus side, because you've opened this side of the board, it's a lot safer to castle to the king side. The only problem is you need to move this pawn to free up that bishop. Obviously, if the gambit's accepted, black's next move would be d takes c4. At that point, I would probably push this pawn, attacking the pawn that just took mine, freeing up this bishop, and not really. The only problem is now it blacks off this bishop on the black file, on the black diagonal. A good way to decline the gambit for black is to push the bishop to f5, bringing your control of the board back into the center rather than being pulled off center, or pushing the knight up to c6. The only deal with this is white might be tempted to take this pawn, lining you up for an attack on your knight here, which would almost necessitate you either pulling this knight somewhere else to avoid its capture, or taking the pawn with queen to c5, which I hate because then it puts your queen out there for almost immediate attack. White would then go knight to c3, queen's under attack, and now you're wasting time moving a piece more than once. Another good response, in case white decides to take this pawn on the next move, would be knight to f6, protecting the pawn and securing some of your control over the center of the board. The last opening for white is pushing the pawn on c4. This is called the English opening, and it is a really slow developing game, and basically you're attacking the center of the board using a flank, which isn't necessarily a very strong position, but it can cause an off-balance game that ends up in a very brutal mid-game of pieces being exchanged and a fight for the center. The best response for black probably is e5 here on the center. For me, when I played this, that seemed to be black's response most of the time, and my next move was always e4. So now I've pulled the game back to the center a little bit, secured a pretty solid attack on this d5 square, and I'm now protecting that pawn while developing a piece. Now that we have the board spun around, we're going to look at opening moves for black. And you can usually tell an opening move is a black opening because it'll usually have defense in the name. Since white moves first, black's moving second, and it's automatically assumed you're on the defense unless white makes a poor move, such as pushing pawn f3. Most of black's defenses that I'll show you are centered around white's pawn to e4, and that's because that's the opening that is most often played for white. The first one is called the Sicilian Defense. So when white pushes that pawn to e4, black responds with a pawn to e6. This is an apparently weak opening. I mean, you didn't really take control of any of the center of the board. You are attacking this square, but you could be up here attacking this square. But it does set you up for an attack on this white pawn. say white decides to go with the Ruy Lopez opening, because he wouldn't play the Gambit because there's no pawn to take the pawn over here, so the Gambit's pointless right off the bat with the Sicilian Defense. So it would most likely be knight to f3 as his second move, at which point you can, as I said, set up your attack on that pawn for control of the center of the board by pushing a pawn to d5. And at the same time, you've opened up your queen side pretty good to allow the queen out, the white bishop can get out, and of course the knight can get out after those other two pieces by going to d7, which isn't necessarily a really strong move, but you don't have the option of going to c6 when you do this opening. The next defense is the French defense. So as normal, white plays e4, and for the French defense you play pawn to e6, which isn't pushing up here into the normal position that you think black would want to do, but at the same time it automatically shuts down that gambit because your pawn isn't here to attack that square. And this is another preparation move for pawn to d5. So show that again. Knight would probably be the Ruy Lopez opening to to f3, and then black would play pawn to d5, attacking this center pawn. This one's a little bit more opening up on the king side just slightly, allowing this black bishop out, but you've automatically blocked off this white bishop until this pawn clears out of this area. The other thing is, once you play this move, white is either going to protect this pawn by pushing a pawn to d3, or pulling his knight out to c3, which would protect this pawn and attack this pawn. If I was black at this point, I would definitely push this pawn into attacking this knight. And that might look like an unsupported pawn that's just going to be taken by this knight over here, but as soon as he takes that pawn, he loses that knight to this queen. And that would be, he takes the pawn, queen takes knight on d4. If he pushes the pawn to d3, you could force a pawn exchange. Pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, at which point you've given up a little center position, but if you're a strong player, you have forced a possible queen swap. Queen takes d1, at which point the king's in check, and his only move is to take king takes d1. And now at this point, the king is unable to castle later in the game. He is pretty much stuck in the center of the board. So that was the French defense. Probably a little bit hairier than the Sicilian defense, especially if you go that queen swap route. But if you're going to do the queen swap, make sure you're the stronger player before you do that. If you're a slightly weaker player, you might be able to get away with it. Like I said, you just pretty much froze white's king in the middle of the board, and that could really hurt him through the middle game and possibly even into the end game, as you're able to castle and bring your rooks to bear on that king's position. The third opening for black we'll look at, as normal, white plays e4. You could go with the Scandinavian defense, which would be pawn to d5. And basically you're attacking this pawn with a defended pawn that's protected by the queen. a straight up, right off the bat attack on the center of the board, forcing white to make a choice to either take and lose a pawn and the center of the board, or to pull knight out to c3, protecting this pawn and being pushed back onto the defense and allowing black a chance to attack. At which point black will probably push this pawn to d4, attacking this knight. And pretty much, since there's nothing here to attack this pawn, the only option for the knight is to lose it, retreat back to b1, retreat to e2, which would block off the king and possible development of this bishop, but it would attack this pawn with the knight. But that's still not a good trade, because if you take this pawn, you now lost your knight to the queen, all for a pawn. That's the Scandinavian defense. The next, or the fourth defense we're going to look at for black, is when white pushes a pawn to d4, going with maybe the queen's gambit opening. And in this case, you'd probably go with the Slav defense, which is to mirror that, pawn to d5, which is perfect for white because he thinks you're going to go for the queen's gambit, so he pushes up the pawn to c4, at which point you're going to play pawn to c6, basically supporting this pawn up here in case white decides to take it, and opening up your queen side for piece development. And if you remember, this is what I covered during the queen's gambit as a possible response, and it's a really great response. And again, that's the Slav defense. And then, because e4 was such a widely played move and I showed 3 defenses for it, I added one bonus defense in there, kind of. Instead of just doing 4 black openings, I decided to do 5, and that way I would have at least 2 defenses for the queen's gambit. So white opens with pawn to d4, and this is called the King's Indian defense, and that's because it happens over here on the king side. So black would play knight to f6. You're now attacking this square and keeping this pawn from pushing up to this square. White plays pawn to c4. I'm not quite sure why that would be the move, because the queen's gambit pretty much needs a pawn up here to be viable. And as black, your response is pawn to g6. Normally I said pushing a pawn in this position on the opening is horrible, except for the King's Indian defense. And that's mainly because the pawn push isn't the first move. And then what it allows for your follow-up move is to get your bishop over here on the longest diagonal available for the bishop to move along. And that would be the King's Indian defense. This was just a real quick overview of these openings. As you get better at chess, you'll want to come back and look at them more in depth and all the possible variations you can move into. And we'll probably cover some more advanced openings later on, or come back in a much later video and cover the pitfalls of these openings and what to watch out for, and what you want to capitalize on and possible responses. I do a much more in-depth review of each opening. We'll probably do like a single 15 to 20 minute video on each opening. These are just some quick openings that you can memorize to help you get into the middle game, and that's where you're going to probably learn the most about chess, is the middle game and the end game. In fact, my next video is going to be about some mid-game tactics, where I'll talk about forks, skewers, pins, discovered check, and maybe poisoned pieces. Although I kind of feel like Poison Piece might be a bit more of a in-game type tactic. It's basically where you throw out maybe the queen and it looks like a really good thing, like you're just giving away the queen, you're sacrificing it, but what it does is it sets you up for very devastating results that usually leads immediately into the end game with you losing the game. But we'll definitely at least cover forks, pins, and skewers. Those are some of my favorite things to do during the game, and they're kind of an intermediate tactic. If you learn it early on, it's really going to help you excel above other players who might be on the same level as you, or were on the same level as you. And then after that, I'll cover some in-game tactics and how to go about achieving checkmate with different piece setups. And that will be the fifth video. It'll be the fifth video. Hope you like this video. Please like, comment, subscribe. I read all the comments, at least right now I do, since there's so little of them, and I try to respond to them if they merit a response. So feel free to ask a question. See you in the next video.